And if you ask patients who have these conditions and you say, do you think you're going to have depression next week? They would say, well, of course I will. I've had this for 10 years. Why would I not have it next week? And so what we're doing with this psilocybin is we're introducing this transient state of high entropy. And this is reflected in the activity in the brain during the effects of the drug that then has a sort of a longer tail of sort of disrupting these sort of rigid behavioral states, if you will.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. My name is Keith Fiveson, the official podcast for the Psychedelic Science Convention 2023. And today we're thrilled to have one of the pioneers in the field of psychedelic nursing, Mr. Andrew Penn. As a co-founder of OpenNurses.org, an organization of psychedelic and entheogenic nurses, Andrew has been on the forefront of the movement to integrate psychedelic therapies into mainstream healthcare. Andrew is also a clinical professor in the Department of Community Health Systems at the School of Nursing at the University of California in San Francisco. He brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise in mental health, addiction, and trauma, having worked as a nurse practitioner at the San Francisco Veterans Administration Residency program. But that's not all. Andrew is also a co-principal investigator at the Translational Psychedelic Research Program, acronym is TRIP Lab, and he's leading a study on psilocybin-facilitated therapy for major depression, which is sponsored by USANA Institute. With such an impressive background and an extensive experience in psychedelic nursing, Andrew is a true trailblazer in the field. I'm really excited. We're excited to have him here on the Mindfulness Experience podcast as he shares his experience about his work, his insights, and the vision for the future of the psychedelic therapies and mindfulness in healthcare. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Andrew Penn to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. Hey, I am here with Andrew Penn, who is involved in the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention. And I really want to first say I'm so honored for you to be here and to have this opportunity to lift up your session there. You're going to be doing a session, I believe you said, it's Who Can Be a Psychedelic Therapist? And that'll be at the convention in June. Can you talk a little bit about that and talk about, your background and really why are you at the convention?
Yeah, thanks, Keith, and thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah, so my background is as a nurse. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner by training and have been for about 20 years. And I'm also the co-founder of an organization called Open Nurses, or the Organization of Psychedelic and Entheogenic Nurses. And part of our mission is to really include nurses in the in psychedelic therapy in all aspects. And what we're going to be talking about in this session is, so I'm going to be part of a panel along with some colleagues from different backgrounds. And we're going to be talking about this question, which is becoming increasingly relevant as we get closer to FDA approval of things like MDMA, of how are we actually going to deliver the therapy that needs to go along with these compounds. And as anybody who's been following the psychedelic space knows, this is an active and really a challenging question, because this is really the first time where we've had a treatment where it's both a drug and a psychotherapy. And I would argue it's primarily a psychotherapy that is catalyzed by a drug. So that creates some regulatory challenges, because the FDA, who will be responsible for approving the drug, really is not familiar with psychotherapy. They don't regulate psychotherapy. And so we're sort of awaiting guidance from them as to what their regulatory guidelines are going to be. And we're also starting to look at just the scale issue. People like Rick Doblin have talked about needing between 50 and 100,000 psychotherapists, or psychedelic therapists, I should say, in order to deliver this work. And that's going to create some real challenges because we don't have enough conventional therapists right now in many areas of the country, even resource rich and densely populated ones like the San Francisco Bay Area. It's really hard to find a conventional therapist who has availability right now. And so what we're going to explore in this session, as I understand it, is really how do we bring multiple different professional backgrounds into this work in order to provide the safe container and the therapeutic guidance that people are going to need to safely and successfully undergo psychedelic therapy. And my small piece of it will be to talk about the role that nurses can play in this work.
Well, it's fascinating because you and I we talked a little bit before the session, and you went to the California Institute of Integral Studies, I understand, and you have that background. You're also a nurse. You also are able to administer, the medicine, if you will. And I know that MDMA will probably, through the FDA, probably be legal by next year. Maybe even sooner than that, according to some of the things that I've heard. But, so what is the role of nursing? You're the founder of opennurses.org, an organization of psychedelic and entheogenic nurses. And what kind of support and community does that organization offer to nurses in the field? And, really, how has it contributed to the growth and acceptance of psychedelic therapies in the mainstream healthcare? Is there this growth? Is that one of the paths? And then from your view, perhaps you can talk to the other elements that might be involved with that, obviously, from a therapeutic viewpoint and how that might mesh together.
Absolutely. So I'm a co-founder of the organization. So I was a co-founder along with three of my colleagues from that CIS program. So Angela Ward and Wendy Marusic and Liz Willis and I, when we went through the program back in 2017, and it's funny to say back in 2017 as if it was a long time ago. But as we all know, psychedelics engender time dilation. And it seems like a lot has happened in those few short years. One of the things that we realized is that while we knew a handful of nurses in the space, we knew people like Annie Mithofer and Maria Mangini and Karen Cooper, we didn't really know that many nurses in the space. And as we started talking about it, we realized how well situated nurses were to doing this work. And Wendy Marusic has coined this really lovely phrase that nurses are the Swiss Army knife of psychedelics. And, in the same way the Swiss Army knife can do lots of different things, nurses can do a lot of different things in the psychedelic space, including, not only administering medication and managing the physiologic side effects, but also we're a profession that is no stranger to long days with a patient at the bedside in a non-ordinary state. If you, a lot of therapists, when you tell them, these sessions can be 6, 7, 8 hours long, they kind of look at you with raised eyebrows. And, my nurse friends say, well, that's a short shift in the ICU. A typical shift is 12 hours with a patient in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. So this idea of being present and delivering care and really supporting the patient's own healing process, that's the native intelligence of nurses. And you couple that with the fact that nurses are the most trusted profession in America and have been for the last 2 decades. And also adding in this thorny question that we've had in the psychedelic space of how do we care for the physical body during psychedelics? Because clearly the psychedelic affects not only the emotional and psychological experience, but also the physiologic experience. And, people can sort of lose awareness of their body, for example. And so there's a lot of the reason why we have these sessions be attended is to make sure that the person stays safe. But, we know in our research studies that we prepare for the possibility that somebody might lose control of their bladder, for example, example, during a session. And, and while it certainly doesn't happen very often, it can happen. And the idea that nurses are quite comfortable taking care of somebody's physical body in a way that's appropriate, safe, and respectful, and certainly never sexual, is also something that I think nurses bring to this. I mean, nurses touch patients' bodies every day in the course of delivering care, and it's a non-issue within nursing. You don't hear about scandals in nursing about sexual abuse, for example. And I think that's another area where nurses really bring a strong suit to the work. And so we founded this organization in kind of a, that old, if you build it, they will come kind of idea. And so we just sort of bootstrapped this together with a website and a Facebook page and a mailing list. And lo and behold, over the last 2.5, almost 3 years now, we have over 2,000 people that subscribe to our newsletter. We do a monthly interview series that we archive on YouTube. So we've now done, I think, probably close to 30 or more interviews with nurses and nursing aligned colleagues in our field, asking them about the work that they're doing. And we've really become a resource for younger nurses or nurses that are thinking about transitioning into psychedelic work. How do you get into this work? What kind of training is there? What are the regulatory issues to think about? So this it's really been a delightful success in having nurses, realizing that there's so many nurses, not only in the US, but we have people on our mailing list who live in Africa, who live in Europe, who live in Asia. Really, there's an international interest from nurses around how to do this work. And increasingly, we're seeing interest from the psychotherapy space, because what I think we are all starting to realize, as I mentioned earlier, is that we just don't have enough therapists to do this work. And there's going to be an additional challenge that's introduced when people leave more conventional practice to engage in psychedelic therapy work, that, if you were a therapist seeing, say, 20 or 25 clients a week, and you go down to doing 4 psychedelic sessions a week and maybe a day of integration and preparation, well, who's going to treat those other 21 patients? Certainly there's not an abundance of therapists with time on their hands now. So I think it actually might have the unintended consequence of putting more pressure on the system rather than relieving it. And, people that are maybe more optimistic about this modality would say, well, you're going to cure a bunch of those people. And while there may be some people that can go through a treatment and no longer need additional treatment, what we're starting to see in later studies is that while these treatments do have a pretty profound effect, for a lot of people, that effect does have an expiration date, and they probably will need repeated doses over time, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, something like that for depression, but it's probably not going to be a one and done model. And so all these things really introduce these challenges of, well, how are we going to actually operationalize this? And we really think that nurses are going to be a central part of addressing that issue.
Well, I really love the mission, and I love what you've done with opennurses.org. And the growth of it is tremendous. You and I talked a little bit before we got together on the podcast here about, preparation, dosing, and then integration. So, in my view, certainly the preparation is very important. This is the psychological mindset, if you will, to go ahead and get you into the mood or get you into the understanding of where you're going to be going and how you're going to be doing it, right? And then there is the dosing element, which is also very important, the setting, if you will, right? So the mindset, the setting, and in the setting, this is where I certainly see opennurses.org, and the opportunity to dose and work with, individuals while they're in a very non-ordinary state and they're in a state of vulnerability. I mean, to your point, there's a lot of trust there. But then I also believe that there is a real opportunity in the integration. This is the breathing process, the ability to talk through, the ability to look at, and the ability to integrate into one's life and activate, a lot of the things that come up because we all know that, you don't just sort of get through your journey and then all of a sudden you pop up and you're a new person. I mean, that doesn't happen.
No.
So I'm just wondering, with your work here, you've done a lot of work. Can you talk to that and talk to, perhaps some of the other work that relates to opennurses.org, and how does it all come together?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that there's been probably too much focus on the drug experience itself and not enough on the preparation and integration. I mean, look, we love miracle cures in this culture, right? We love the idea that you're going to take a pill. I mean, I've seen these headlines that, one dose of magic mushrooms and depression was gone.
Right.
And it's unfortunate that that's the narrative that's being promulgated, because what it erases is really the intention, which is critical, as you point out, and then the integration work. And one of the things that I think nurses do a lot of is working with patients both before and after an event. So somebody who might be undergoing a major surgery, for example, is going to need preparation as to how their life might change following that surgery. Or I think about midwives who work with people that are birthing, right? And there's a lot of preparation, and there's a lot of in fact, I was part of a writing team that wrote an article in the Journal of Midwifery and Women's Health, really drawing these parallels that when you go to those healthy baby visits before you give birth, a lot of that is measuring your vitals and things like that, but a lot of it is actually developing a relationship. And it's developing trust and an ability to let go. So starting to sound familiar. Yeah. And so when the birth actually happens and things get difficult, there's already that established relationship of trust that can be leveraged in those moments. And what we're really encouraging people to do in that setting, and very similar to psychedelics, is that we're encouraging them to trust that the process will unfold in a way that ultimately is helpful. Even if in that very moment that notion seems kind of questionable. I think there's been many a person giving birth who has said, get me out of here, right? And I'm probably more than one person in the middle of a psychedelic session who would like to hit the eject button and get out. But once you're in, you've kind of committed. Right. And what you need in that moment of fear or apprehension is to be able to look at somebody who you've already spent the time with, and for you to know on some kind of cellular level that you're going to be okay. And that's what we're doing in the preparation. And then the integration, to extend it to the childbirth, is sort of like the postpartum visits. It's the, oh my gosh, I have a baby and I'm not sure how to do this. Right. Oh my gosh, I've had these insights and I'm not sure how to work them into my life. Because, insights are great. But they're a little bit like morning dew. They evaporate as soon as the day gets underway. Right. And it's very easy to have an insight and really not do anything with it, and I think we've all probably been guilty of that in some form or another.
Yeah. And that's part of the problem, because we're habitual human beings, and we can get into a rut pattern, and that's part of the challenge, especially for individuals who have depression, or have started to push down things that happened in their lives, traumas that they didn't want to look at, or had reaction formations to specific events that I'll never go hungry again. And of course, they hoard. So that could be the alternative to that. Now, you're working with people who have major depression. You're doing some work at the Translational Psychedelic Research Program, and you're doing some work where you're studying psilocybin-facilitated therapy for major depression. Can you talk to that a little bit? Because I know that it sounds like we may be jumping around, but it's all very related, right? Because an individual has to have the preparation, they have to have the journey, they're exposed, they're subconscious, they have a non-ordinary state, and then they come back, and then they have to look at it from an integration or activate it in terms of things that they do differently in their lives. I'm just wondering what your focus in this area, and what do you hope to achieve in the research? What have you seen so far?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to work with a really great team of people that's led by Dr. Josh Woolley. So we call ourselves the Tripper Lab, or the Translational Research Psychedelics Program at UCSF, and we've been part of a number of studies. We started out under the leadership of Jenny Mitchell, working on the MDMA-assisted therapy treatment for PTSD, which was the first of the MAPS phase 3 studies, and gone on to be a site for the USONA-sponsored study of a single dose of psilocybin for major depressive disorder. That was a placebo-controlled trial. And then in more recent years, we've worked on a number of investigator-initiated studies. So one that we're getting close to wrapping up is a small pilot study looking at safety and efficacy of psilocybin-assisted treatment in people with Parkinson's disease and depression, which is a common comorbidity. Around 50% of people with Parkinson's will also have major depression. And that's an important and novel study because most people with progressive neurological diseases like Parkinson's have been excluded from previous studies just in the interest of safety. And so we're looking to see if this can be done safely to treat the depression. To be clear, we're not aiming to treat Parkinson's disease with this, but to treat depression. And we're getting started with a study of people with bipolar 2 depression, which is also another sort of area that's been unexplored up until now, because most people with bipolar disorder have been excluded from existing trials. So I believe we're the second study now to be working on that. And then we're eventually going to do a study on chronic low back pain and using a psilocybin intervention.
Really? Low back pain?
Low back pain, yeah. And that may seem like kind of an outlier, but when you look at the sort of transdiagnostic value of psychedelic therapies, my colleague now at UCSF, Robin Carhart Harris, has done some really important theoretical writing about thinking about certain disease states as being that of having a quality of low entropy, which is physics term which talks about predicting change, right? So there's these diseases that cross widely across the diagnostic manual of psychiatry, but also into other areas that may be more neurological in nature, like chronic pain. But these include things like depression and anorexia nervosa and PTSD and substance use disorders that all have a quality about them that they're difficult to change. They're difficult clinically to get somebody to shift. And if you ask patients who have these conditions and you say, do you think you're going to have depression next week? They would say, well, of course I will. I've had this for 10 years. Why would I not have it next week? And so what we think we're doing with this psilocybin is we're introducing this transient state of high entropy. And this is reflected in the activity in the brain during the effects of the drug that then has a sort of a longer tail of sort of disrupting these sort of rigid behavioral states, if you will. And so that's when we're looking at something like chronic pain, and that may sort of that may look on the outside like somebody has a changed relationship with that illness or with that condition. And this is to put maybe a more fine point on it, one of the things that I wonder about with psychedelic therapies is that, we talk, particularly in psychiatry, in this very kind of biologic model of you either have a disease or you don't have a disease, and it's sort of like how we might think about cancer or infectious disease. Your COVID test is either positive or negative, right? It's either or. Whereas, in psychiatry, we're trafficking more in maladies of the human soul, if you will. So where's the line between fear and an anxiety disorder? Where is the line between sadness and major depression? It's a fuzzy line, right? And what I suspect might be happening with these psychedelic therapies is that we are changing the narrative that people have about them. So we're not necessarily just eradicating the depression or eradicating the PTSD, but we're fundamentally changing the relationship that the person has to the condition, so that they may still have aspects of that condition, but it's not the totality of their human experience. It's not the totality of their identity. It's they go from having this disease that kind of eclipses everything about them to this still being there, but being a much smaller part of who they are. And I think that's a different model than we've kind of thought about, particularly in biological psychiatry, where we tend to use these scales, and we have this idea that if somebody drops below a certain number, then we've eradicated the disease. And I'm not sure that's exactly how it works.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing you talk about is the opportunity to really have a different relationship, interrelationship with our neurology or biology or physiology, or ability to have a different perception of who we are. And it sounds to me a lot like mindfulness. It sounds to me like a lot more like being able to be the witness to your own experience, and then to be able to, in some way, not only take a step back from it, but also sort of rewire it. And you're looking into it from a physiological viewpoint in terms of the individual's experience using psychedelics as a way to kind of dig into that. Is that kind of like what I'm hearing, or am I putting my own spin on it?
No, I don't think you are. And I think one of the things that's interesting about psychedelic therapies is that they really, depending on who you're talking to, it's really kind of like the blind man and the elephant, this old Indian parable about, describing different aspects of the same experience. And I think, if one is looking at this psychedelic experience through a mindfulness lens, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. If you're looking at it through a neuroscience lens, then talking about the default mode network and changes in neural connectivity makes sense. If you're of a more spiritual inclination, having more transcendent experience with God as you imagine it, or the universe, or transpersonal, that getting outside of our little human experience, that and we humans, being the kind of tribal creatures that we are sometimes, I feel like we double down on our preferred explanatory model, and the sort of universe smiles benevolently, hopefully at us, and says, oh, you silly humans, you're quibbling, you're all feeling an elephant, okay, right. And you're all right, and one of you doesn't need to predominate. I mean, if we've learned nothing from psychedelics, it's to embrace the both and rather than the either or. That right. there's a really wide field, and there's room for all of it. And so, mindfulness, absolutely. And we use a lot of mindfulness in our preparation for psychedelic therapy. So in our lab, when we're getting people ready for these sessions, and many of these people have never had a psychedelic experience before. So this is really, quite an exciting and sometimes somewhat frightening opportunity for them, and so we emphasize a lot of mindfulness, both sort of awareness and also grounding that in the physical body. We use simple things like breath and grounding techniques, body scans, things such as that, to really help people have a resource that they can go to when they are less able to access their usual go-to resources, however successful or unsuccessful those may have been over the course of their lives. But we want people to be able to come back into their breath if they become frightened, or if they get overly cerebral, which sometimes can happen with some subjects, to really have a place where they can come back to their physical experience. And what I think we see in integration is that people realize that that we all tell ourselves stories, right? And I've heard, I think it was Tony Bossis that said, the suffering lives in the story. And what I suspect we are doing to some extent is we're helping people change the story about their own maladies. And this is very much in alignment with how I think we see maladies as nurses, is that, our first directive as nurses is to always provide care. If we happen to cure something along the way, that's great. But nurses take care of many things that will never be cured. I think about my colleagues who do amazing work in palliative care. In palliative care, by definition, you're not intending to cure somebody. You're intending to help relieve their suffering. And a lot of times what alleviates suffering is changing the story, changing the narrative around that illness. And that's part of what we do as nurses. And I think it's part of what we do as psychedelic therapists.
Yeah. I think, in the work that I do, I always say, change your story, you change your life.
Yeah.
And the work really is about getting a different narrative, or really helping you to understand the old narrative so you can, really have some compassion or awareness around it, and then let it go, and then create a new narrative, which allows you to go ahead and be empowered to have your own, efficacy and your own sense of self and your own agency. So I'm wondering, in your opinion, as we start to take a look at the story, as we start to take a look at healthcare and the state of healthcare, what are some of the challenges that, you believe that we're going to be seeing or have seen, or, how can we address the challenges by integrating, whether or not it's mindfulness or psychedelic therapies, into the mainstream medicine? Because, we're going to this convention. The convention will have maybe 10,000 people there, over 300 speakers. It's huge. It's in Denver at the Denver Convention Center. And, but yet at the same point, there's still a very small percentage of the population that really gets what the research is about and what these therapies are about. And you're right into the mix of it, and helping to create these changes. So I'm wondering what the challenges are from your viewpoint, and how do you deal with those challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is that ironically, we do have a precedent for this idea of working with your malady, if you will, over time, and making changes. It's called psychotherapy. This is not new technology. The idea of catalyzing it with a drug is the innovation here. And of course, indigenous populations have been using these compounds for millennia, usually with a somewhat different paradigm. They're not necessarily using a psychotherapy paradigm, but there's sort of a broader context often of healing or communion with something that is larger than yourself. And so I think one of the challenges we're going to have in healthcare is how do we slot this? It's sort of human nature to want to scaffold new knowledge onto old knowledge. And so the way that we've sort of created the mental health care landscape in this country is that, if you have a mental health problem, then you either take pills for it, or you go to therapy, or maybe you do some combination of the two, but they're usually delivered by different people, different clinicians who may or may not even be talking to each other. There's a real disintegration of healthcare in this country. And regardless, there's a kind of passivity that happens in both of these models, less so in psychotherapy, but definitely psychopharmacology is sort of a wait and see model. Let's see what happens in the background. And so I think that one of the challenges we're going to have in bringing psychedelics into mainstream society, setting aside the logistical challenges of cost and time, there's a big kerfuffle going on right now in Oregon because the first psilocybin service center just rolled out its price sheet.
Right.
And and the top, the sort of, oddly, they're pricing it by grams of active drug rather than time, which seems like an odd model, but nevertheless, people are a flutter that I think it's over $3,000 for a session at the highest dose. And frankly, that didn't surprise me, for a number of reasons. And I don't think it's because necessarily the people are engaging in profiteering. Anytime you get the government involved with something, there's going to be a lot more expense and fees and such. And so I'm sure some of that is just the overhead of getting something like this off the ground in a legal fashion. But the other issue is time. how
Right.
much is people's time worth?
Right. I mean, if it's
And
12 hours at $200 an hour, you're up to
well,
$2,400 at least.
exactly. So,
At least.
I did
Yeah.
some back of the envelope calculations for our MAP study and realized, well, when you look at all the prep, integration, and dosing sessions, it's about 48 hours of
Mhm.
face-to-face time. And you
Mhm.
have two therapists. And
Mhm.
if you're going to pay those two therapists, sort of market rate, which is even a low market rate in the San Francisco Bay Area of $200 an hour, you're looking at $18,000 in labor costs alone.
Right.
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 And, a lot of people in the psychedelic community want this to be free. And I appreciate that idealism, but, unless those people are willing to spend all this time and money on their professional training and then work pro bono, which, many of us don't have the luxury of doing,
Mhm.
somebody's going to have to be compensated for their time, and that's going to cost money. And then there's the cost of the drug, which is a separate issue. And a lot of the cost of the drug is involving and recouping the millions and millions of dollars that go into the development. And so this isn't going to be cheap. And
Mhm.
so we're
Certainly
going to have
certainly not for the therapeutic model.
no, not for the therapeutic model. And we're going to have to think about, how do we do this in a more cost-effective way? There's a number of different ways that we might think about, one of which might be group dosing. That's certainly significant. Another is thinking about the cost of the individual professionals involved.
Mhm.
I honestly think the two therapist model is going to be dead on arrival. I just don't see that being paid for by health insurers. It's a lovely and enriched model.
What are
But
your thoughts? So, what are your thoughts about the RFRA model?
I'm not familiar with that.
The Religious Freedom Restoration Act, sacrament as a part of a church or a community?
I mean, I think that that has precedent, obviously, with organizations like the Native American Church and the ayahuasca churches. I worry about that being offered as sort of a pseudo therapy model without the guardrails that psychotherapists have to agree to. So, one of the reasons why we have professional licenses in healthcare is to protect the public from unsavory and untrained actors. It's to make sure that if you go to a clinician, that they have some at least minimal level of qualifications, and that there is some recourse if that person harms you. I don't know if such guardrails have been created within the religious freedom.
No,
movement.
they have not. And I know that I spoke with Allison Hoots recently, and she's created this thing called the Sacred Alliance, which is basically to create the guardrails, because to your point, there aren't the guardrails there. And, the therapeutic model is the one that seems to work clearly in terms of the efficacy and in terms of the research. So that's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me in the psychedelic space, I have a paper that's in review right now that Rachel Yehuda and I wrote, and we're really sort of talking about, where are the gaps that we have in our knowledge around psychedelics, and how do we address those to prevent them from becoming real pitfalls in practice? And one of the things that we talk about in there is that there's a lot of extension of these findings into settings which are not replicating the way that those findings came about. So that's a convoluted way of saying, so, if you are a study subject at Hopkins or UCSF undergoing this treatment, you can't, and you get this outcome on average, you can't necessarily say that if you go to a service center in Oregon and sit with somebody who is not gone through that training, and you don't go through that same screening and protocol, that the same findings or the same level of safety will be replicated. And that this may be sort of an unpopular view within the psychedelic space, because I think there's a lot of rush to bring this into the public space. And I understand why. Prohibition is a terrible policy. It clearly hasn't worked. And one of the things that it has unfortunately has created is a desire to want to believe everything that is opposite is true. So anything that opposes prohibition therefore must be true, and often goes unquestioned. And so anything that brings more psychedelics into the public space is seen as a net good. And I'm not as enthusiastic about that. I'm a little more apprehensive, because I think I think there are certain groups and individuals who may be more at risk for bad outcomes unless they are held carefully. Now, in our studies, we've probably gone the other way. We've had an abundance of caution, sometimes to the degree of absurdity, but that's kind of the nature of doing research in an academic institution, is that they're incredibly conservative and primarily driven by safety above all else. Whereas these more community organizations are tending to sort of downplay safety risks, which I think is concerning, and overstate potential benefits, sometimes where we don't have evidence for those benefits. And so what I'm hoping is that as this field goes forward, is that those two forces, if you will have a confluence where there's some kind of reconciliation, where the enthusiasts can maybe temper some of their enthusiasm and think about how to do this most safely. And certainly prohibition, I hope, sees its way out of into the dustbin of history, because that isn't an effective public policy. But that there is also there can be a broadening of the people that can benefit from this, which is why we're doing these studies with groups that have been excluded historically from these studies, is because we need to know if these people can be treated safely with these compounds as well.
Yeah, I think your point is so valuable and so valid, that set setting and integration are really key. And there's a variable there based on, just because you take the drug doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the same results if you're in, Oregon, or whether or not you're in New York, wherever you are. A lot of it has to do with set setting and integration, and also the way, it is administered. So you do have to have those guardrails. You do have to have some disciplines around how this is administered. And certainly, looking at individuals and having some screening and having some, conversations, these are important areas. These are important areas to look at. Let me ask you, as someone who's worked in the field for many years, and you're going to be in Denver. I'll see you there. I look forward to that. Where do you think things are going? And do you have any advice for, any professionals, nurses, therapists, what have you, researchers that might be interested in working in the field going forward? What kind of skills or knowledge, maybe all of that pulled together? Or maybe you don't have any thoughts, you're just opening your mind and you're waiting to see what happens. I mean, what are your thoughts about that, Andrew?
Yeah, there's a big gold rush happening right now in the space, right? There's a lot of people that have waited a long time for this to happen, myself being one of them, but there's people that have waited a lot longer than me. And so there's an impatience, which I totally understand, and a kind of urgency. And that's as further underscored by the dismal state of mental health in this country, right? I mean, clearly what we're doing isn't sufficient. And so that urgency is warranted, and I understand it. I get a lot of, so one of the things I think we're going to need to think about is, how does this get integrated into our existing healthcare system and our existing provision of mental health care? And I think in that sort of blue sky thinking, sometimes there is this belief that this is going to just obliterate mental health treatment as we know it now. And I just don't believe that's going to be the case. I think if anything, we need to integrate it into that. And so I get messages, regularly from people earlier in career than me saying, I'm thinking about going into nursing school, or I'm thinking about becoming a therapist. I want to be a psychedelic therapist. And I say, that's great. I would encourage you to become a regular therapist first, or become a regular nurse first, for a couple of different reasons. I mean, one, first of all, we shouldn't count our chickens till they're hatched, right? None of these compounds, other than, the off-label use of ketamine and the labeled use of esketamine, are FDA-approved drugs. Bad things could happen, and they could either not be approved,
Absolutely.
a very unpopular opinion, which a lot of people have not even considered, or they could be severely restricted in their use. We could see we could see some bad outcomes that happen. There's a cautionary tale, and if I could just take a quick tangent, a drug called Chantix, which came out about 20 years ago now for the treatment of smoking cessation. Varenicline. It's a really novel drug in treatment of smoking cessation. And of course, tobacco use kills millions of people a year around the world. And so this drug comes out, and then around 2006, there was these case reports that people with existing mental illness were having exacerbation of that. People with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder who use tobacco at a very disproportionate rate, and it shortens their lives considerably, were having this. And so the FDA throws a black box warning onto the drug. And so suddenly people stop using this drug. And of course, that means that people with schizophrenia go on to continue to use tobacco and have all the attendant health problems that go along with that. And then a few years afterwards, it turns out that more studies were done. Turns out that wasn't the case. And the FDA pulled the black box warning off. But in the meantime, a lot of people smoked a lot of cigarettes who might have not otherwise smoked them had they been treated with varenicline. And varenicline never quite kind of regained its reputation, right?
Right.
And I think
I remember Chantix.
Yeah, right. Very useful drug. And I think that's a cautionary tale for the psychedelic space, in that, if we do this too fast and we do this without appropriate cautions and guardrails in place, then we run the risk of having some high-profile bad outcomes. And I'm really watching Oregon carefully around this because, while I think they could definitely show the country kind of like what happened with cannabis legalization, that you can do this and the sky doesn't fall and the world doesn't end, and it turns out okay. Or there could be some very high profile bad outcomes that occur in that context. And the media that loves us right now will turn on us in an instant. Yeah. If bad outcomes come, because they're
if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly, because they're kind of agnostic about this. They're interested in viewers. They're not interested in supporting a positive psychedelic narrative. So whatever the most appealing story is, it's going to get attention. And I'm not sure the psychedelic space it knows how to handle that. There's a cautionary tale from the 60s, when Art Linkletter, was a very popular TV personality in the day, when his daughter died by suicide, and he tried to invoke LSD. LSD, it had a tremendous catalyst effect on getting the Controlled Substance Act passed. And so I guess what I'm saying here is, I love the enthusiasm in the psychedelic space. I love the people in the psychedelic space, but I also feel like, we really need to there's a maturational need that I feel like needs to happen. I kind of feel like there's, we keep calling it the psychedelic renaissance, but it feels like the psychedelic adolescence sometimes.
It has to be a little bit of titration, a little bit of, a little bit of on, off, you got to deal with it, because we are also dealing with systemic or societal trauma that really is around the censorship of psychedelics.
Yes, so, absolutely. And ask anybody who's traumatized, who's been through a trauma. And I do feel like the drug war has been a collective trauma for many people, that, the first thing that does to you is it makes you not able to trust anybody.
Exactly.
Right. And so that's what happened when we lied to people about the effects of drugs for 50 years, is that we sacrifice, the first casualty of war is truth. Right. And so that's what's happened. And so there's a lot of, you said reaction formation earlier, there's a lot of this idea that if it's anti-prohibitionist, it must be true. Right. And I want to be very clear. I have no interest in continuing or increasing prohibition, but I do feel like it's incumbent on the psychedelic community to do this right. And I understand their impatience. I understand the urgency, but if we don't do it right, we really run the risk of setting the clock back another 50 years. I'm not sure any of us who are alive now are going to be around to get to see the next go round if we don't get it right this time.
Well, that's a really good point to sort of end on, or to crescendo on. And I really do believe that. And I think Denver is, and the Psychedelic Science 2023 conference convention is going to really help in terms of, lifting that up and providing some structure around that, because I myself, I went through the 60s. I saw the drug wars. I was involved with all of that, and I saw that, what happened with Nixon and so on and so forth. So I'm really glad that we're at this point, but I'm also very concerned that we go by the route of cannabis in some way, that there's, a huge underground, that we wind up seeing, the proliferation or the use without the guardrails or without the structure or without the, the sensibilities around it to go ahead and make sure that it's used properly. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So,
yeah, I think we can do this. But I think it has to come from us, and that means we're going to have a lot of sort of uncomfortable conversations around how to do this. But I would rather that we be uncomfortable on our terms than, say, a government regulator's terms, which is where it'll come from if we don't do it right. So I think we have an opportunity here, but it does require a little bit of tempering of our enthusiasm, which, may be somewhat of an unpopular opinion, but I'm going to stick to it.
And I'm going to support you. So
thank you. Thanks, Keith.
You're welcome. So Andrew Penn, how can people get a hold of you if they want more information on opennurses.org or any of the other projects that you're involved with?
Yeah, so opennurses.org has a slight little trick to it. It only has one N, and so it's OPENURSES.org. And people can reach me through my website, which is Andrew Penn, NP, as in nurse practitioner.com.
Great. And I, again, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you, shaking your hands, giving you a bro hug when we're in Denver. And, I really wish you a lot of luck on your talk and your session when you're out there. And thank you very much again for being on the Mindfulness Experience podcast.
Thanks, Keith. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to meeting you and lots of other folks in Denver. It's going to be a great time.
Good. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fivesen.